happy to be here with you today. And I guess I would just say, um, also very happy to be able to celebrate something that's a first for this nation, for the country, and that is the confirmation of Deb Haaland as the new Secretary of Interior. I'm extremely happy for her. I know her personally, and she is from New Mexico. She's from Laguna and Jemez Pueblo, and this has been. I don't know how many people may or may not be familiar, may be familiar with her history, but she ran for Congress in New Mexico, was the first Native person to ever be part of the New Mexico congressional delegation, and now will soon assume the position of Cabinet Secretary for Interior. Again, this is historic for Pueblo people. This is historic for Indian people, and this is historic for the nation because there has never been, in the history of this country, there has never been a Native person serve on the cabinet. So it's something wonderful to celebrate. And I had to share that with you because we all could use some good news, and that's part of I think of my way of starting the morning. What I would like to do today is, and I will go into the slides shortly, but just what I wanted to do really was just I'm going to probably cover more than is reasonable, but I'd rather try and do more than not do enough. And that is, I'll be covering basically the concept of defining and public health, defining social justice, and defining social determinants of health, as well as structural determinants of health. And then the last piece will be a brief conversation about truth and reconciliation, and what that means, and how it's been, nations have engaged in that. But I think let me go ahead and just open the slide up, and I guess the Zoom is white man's smoke signals, or India. It's the white man's version of smoke signals for Indians. So here we go, and I'll be right with you. There we go. There's the opening page. But what I wanted to really, I think, you can read my bio and have a conversation about the things that I've, my credentials and those sort of formal professional sort of accomplishments. But I think that for me, really what is important at this particular point in time, what is really important is my sharing who I am, my lived experience as an American Indian man, as an American Indian man who's been on this planet 69 years, and as an American Indian man who's been actively involved personally and professionally in social work, in public health, and in a variety of areas related to that. Part of my own personal experience, adult child of an alcoholic, my family has been significantly impacted, lost my father to alcohol abuse, as well as the rest of most of his family and my father's side of the family being significantly impacted by substance abuse. And sad to say that some of my family still is dealing with that very real challenge. That sort of experience growing up as a young boy, as a child, and into a young man, really has, we all have our personal challenges. One of my personal challenges, most significantly, has been that whole challenge of coming from a family that was significantly impacted by substance abuse. Fortunately, as is often the case, and I'm blessed, I had a mother that was always there, always supportive, always encouraging, and always loving. And I can honestly say, if it was not for her, I wouldn't be here today, and none of the good things that have happened to me would have happened had it not been for a mother's love. The other significant element in my history, I think, would have to also reference is, I think that something that has been a challenge throughout my life and career has been racism. And oftentimes I think some of us are hesitant to talk about that, but in fact it is real. It impacts us personally. It impacts us professionally. And I've got more stories than you would probably want to hear about those experiences. But I think the thing that I would say is that I've not let that define me. Many of us have challenges. They vary. There's a variety of challenges that we experience. And I think it's important for us to face those challenges. I'm going to now tell you just a brief story that sort of overlays my presentation. And that is, as a young man, having finished my master's degree in social work in 1977 from the University of Utah, I returned home to New Mexico. And my first professional position was that of a medical social worker at the Santa Fe Indian Hospital that served 12 tribes at the time. It was, again, a small hospital. I think it was 60 some beds, but pretty much provided an array of services for a community. But one of the significant events that occurred at that time, sort of one of these defining sort of moments, was I had the opportunity to go to my first training, and being new to all of this, the trip involved my traveling to Phoenix. It was a behavioral health conference, and I was I was really excited by the opportunity. And so I think it was like that morning I got up and was very excited and motivated, went down to the conference, and as oftentimes was the case in those days, it typically was a non-native MD or PhD that was presenting about issues impacting Native communities. And so this gentleman went into his presentation, had the usual, didn't have PowerPoints at that time, but went into his usual presentation about Native people and sort of the negative aspects that were impacting Native communities, the fact that there was depression in Native communities, the fact that there was substance abuse, the fact that we had high suicide rates, the fact that just a host of negative sort of data, which I understood within that context, and appreciated it in many ways. But at the same time, the more he went on, I think the lower I went into my seat. So when we had the opportunity at the end of his presentation, I raised my hand and I introduced myself, and I said, I appreciate your presentation. I said, but after your presentation, I'm feeling depressed. I feel like I want to drink. I'm feeling sort of suicidal, and I'm kind of at ends at this point. And of course, it was meant in a humorous way. People laughed, but it really did make an impression on me as a young professional, as a young man, as a young Native man, that there were all these negatives. Because I, in fact, was aware of the fact that we were more and have been and always have a history that of health, but that's not what we were looking at, and that's not what he was presenting. I think the main takeaway that as I've grown older and had more experience is that at that point in time, I think the focus was on dysfunction and, in a sense, blaming people for the problems that they had. Not to say that there's not some level of responsibility, but the reality is you take any population, any community, and you subject them to certain environmental factors, and such as poverty, such as racism, and you're going to see certain sort of conditions manifest. It's not all that unusual for any community, be it Native, be it Black, be it white. I don't care what community. You put situations in place, you create the conditions either that promote health or those conditions that deny people the opportunity to be healthy. And that's what I want to go into right now in terms of my first slide. Be right there. Okay, here's really just a working definition of public health. And as you can see, public health really is, public health promotes and protects the health of people and the communities where they live, learn, work, and play. And this is very much, for those of you who may be familiar with public health, this is really sort of, the bottom, the baseline for what public health is. Doctors may treat people who are sick, and I certainly saw that in the hospitals and in my career. But what public health does is work to prevent people from being healthy or getting sick. And the experience in Santa Fe at the Indian Hospital, and at this point in my career, clearly illuminated that dichotomy, in that when I was there working with patients from the community, I think it didn't take too long before I realized that no matter how good I was, no matter what I did, that there was always going to be somebody in the queue. It was like a revolving door, and I would work with somebody, provide them what as much as I could to move them along to getting the services, to providing support and counseling to them. But there was always somebody else that was going to be in the queue, and that it just never ended. And at that point in my career, I just realized that this is not something that I could continue to do. Felt like that at some point, if I didn't find another niche or another way of addressing the issues that were impacting Native communities, that I was going to need some counseling for sure. And also, I'd have to say that some of the bureaucratic systems, even though they're established to meet the needs of people and Native people, sometimes they're not as effective. Sometimes people are not as committed as you would like. But that was a sort of a point of departure for me. And it was after that I really pursued public health. I went to UC Berkeley School of Public Health with one semester in Hawaii. And it was, I think the thing I walked away from public health with was that public health, interestingly enough, was, I remember being in one course, and it was the professor was talking about how, with basic concepts, clean air, clean land, clean water, and how all these biological systems are connected, and you have to have balance in the natural world, and that in fact all things are interconnected. And what it did for me was really reinforce some basic sort of understandings that came from my community and the values that I had been provided in terms of understanding how the real world works. And really it reinforced an indigenous worldview that all things are in balance, to take it to really make the point, our life, all life comes from the earth. It provides our sustenance. It provides the air, the water, and the land that it takes for human beings to survive, as well as all species. And that was just, it reinforced my respect and reverence for the world. And what I found with my non-native student colleagues is that many of them, sort of like they had never been exposed to that concept, and it was like they had just discovered that that all things are related and all things are connected, all systems. And so it just struck me as, well, doesn't everybody know this? Isn't everybody aware of this? And so it really was sort of a defining moment in terms of that it reinforced the fact that I knew that Native people and the indigenous knowledge and wisdom that comes from indigenous communities and indigenous people really had value and was of importance. And I guess, again, in this day and age with global warming and the threats that we're having, it really, public health again has the potential, when applied, has the potential to really help us understand how all these things are connected and interrelated, and be it the economy, be it whatever, that it all really does tie back to our being respectful of the land and the earth and all species, because we are all interdependent and interconnected. I'll move on now to the next slide. And here the concept of social justice is very much a part of public health values and philosophy. And I'll just go ahead and let you view that. And again, for me, when I take the concept of social justice and I apply it to indigenous populations, to American Indian, Alaska Native, our communities, I really have to. It is significant in this day and age of COVID that we, in fact, are confronted by how just is our country, how just are our systems, and does one have the opportunity to be healthy and to live long and fruitful lives. And the reality for Native people today, pre-COVID, was American Indians have the highest mortality, morbidity rates in this nation to this day. And that's in spite of the fact that we are the only population that has a government-to-government relationship with this nation. We not only are an ethnic community, but we are a political entity. We have tribal governments. And this nation made promises to Native people in treaties and in executive orders. And to this day, those promises have not been fulfilled. I would also say to you that it's not widely known that American Indians have the highest rate of death by police encounters of any racial group in this nation. It's obscured because, and this is all CDC data, it's obscured because our population are small, but that in fact, is a reality for us. I think that the inequities that Native nations have faced and continue to face to this day have been exacerbated by COVID, and with the advent of COVID as of last year, And again, the data again demonstrates that American Indians have the highest rates of COVID of any population in this country to this day. The Lancet Commission, of which I was a member, which just issued a report this month, also their findings demonstrated again that American Indians have the highest COVID rates in the country. It's and then we wonder, well, why is this? And really, in so many ways, if you look at the funding for the Indian Health Service, it's been at 50% of the level of need historically. They're actually per capita, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission report a number of years made the statement that more funding goes to the care per capita of federal prisoners than to care for American Indian people. And so there's these basic inequities in resources, and to make the case even stronger is when we're looking, particularly right now, as one example. It's not the only example, but I think it highlights the issue. Is the Navajo Nation has suffered the greatest number of deaths of any tribe, and why is that? Well, it's a lack of basic resources. It's a lack of investment in infrastructure, high unemployment. 40% of the population have no running water. It's been declared a food desert by the, I believe it was the Agriculture Department. And many of the basic sort of things that we sort of take for granted in our urban existence, running electricity, running water, transportation systems, good opportunities for education, as well as access to quality health care with a system, the Indian Health Services, that has been underfunded forever. So these conditions really put the population of Navajo Nation at risk, and you see that across the nation with Navajo, with Indian tribes and Alaska Native communities as well. These are the things that when it comes to social justice, that for Native people, it really calls out and requires a commitment, and a dedication and a recommitment to ensuring that the First Nations people, Native people, have the same access to opportunities, employment, and housing, and education, and healthcare that many other people have had. This is really an outline of the major points that are involved in social determinants of health. And social determinants of health is a concept that was created about 20 years ago by Sir Michael Marmot, who's a physician and researcher in England. And what he actually coined the phrase social determinants of health, and identified the factors that determine health outcomes for all communities. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the whole notion of zip code versus genetic code. And that basically what it indicates is that, genetically, we all, as human beings, as all members of the human family, same species, we all actually have pretty much the same genetic code. But what do we attribute the differences in inequities in terms of health? And that goes back to this whole concept again of zip code versus genetic code. And you can determine the health of a population and a community by zip code, in that there are certain zip codes that have higher income, better educational opportunities, Um, they have security in terms of unemployment, better working conditions. We can see that playing out in terms of in this age of COVID. Better access to food and healthy food. Again, we see that playing out. Housing, early childhood development, social inclusion, non-discrimination, structural conflict, and access to affordable health services. All of this existed pre-COVID, but what we're now seeing, of course, is this is all being highlighted because of COVID. And it's something we can no longer ignore or pretend that does not exist. There are communities of color, there are poor communities that already lack these basic elements to promote their health and their security and their well-being. And these systems have been impacted in such a negative and adverse way that we're going to be dealing with not only COVID as a medical condition, but all of the ramifications and these variables that produce negative outcomes. The other example I would point out, just a personal example that goes back to a little bit of time, back to my hometown at this point of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was a study that was done by the Bernalillo County Off-Reservation Commission, of which I was a member. And the study basically was to determine what the social conditions were for American Indians in Bernalillo County or the city of Albuquerque. And one of the significant findings, which is not unusual in Indian country, but was that that the average age of death was 56 for American Indians in Bernalillo County. For everyone else, it was 71. This is not an anomaly. In many rural reservation communities, you see statistics that are even worse than that. But it just reinforces the fact that the needs and that the things that determine positive health outcomes are lacking for Native populations. We'll go ahead and I'll move on. Now I'm just going to go ahead and go into sort of a brief description again of what are structural determinants of health. And structural determinants of health really is sort of the framework that produces the social determinants of health in terms of, as you can see, the laws. It really refers to laws, statutes, and ordinances that really, set policy, social policy, and create the conditions for health or ill health. And again, what we see as it relates to some programs that have benefited our nation and our communities and our people, really, you look back at Social Security, you look at Medicare, you look at Medicaid, you look at the Affordable Care Act, and now, most recently, as of just this week, the COVID Relief Act. And I don't want to be all bad news. I mean, we were celebrating Deb Haaland's, the fact that Deb Haaland is assumed her new position, but also I would have to say that COVID Relief Act really is offering some real support, financial support, economic support to the citizens of this country and to governments, both the national federal agencies as well as cities and counties, that really has not been there, that really is required to ensure the health and safety and security of the people of this country. One real positive element that's specific to Native communities is that there was a $3.3 billion commitment in the Relief Act, 3.1, excuse me, in the Relief Act, um, and that is the largest. That is the largest. That is the largest increase. Excuse me, 31 billion. But that is the largest increase in the history of the commitment to Native people in this country. And I'm happy to say that it's going to benefit all of us. I think, as someone who's in public health, the other piece of this is really an opportunity to resource public health infrastructure, which has been reduced. The funding has been reduced historically and over time, and as part and parcel, I think, is why we have not been able to respond. In addition to a lack of national leadership, but there is an opportunity now, I believe, to get things moving, to turn things around, and really ensure the health and well-being again of the people and nation and the nation of this country. What I would, I'll move on to. I'll have a couple comments before I move on to this, but one of the things I did mention was the impact that has occurred in terms of the negative impact that has occurred in terms of Navajo Nation and many other Pueblos, tribes, and nations. But I also have to say and share with you some positive outcomes and some positive responses that have been coming from Native communities. I think that one of the things we've seen, particularly with Jonathan Nez, who's the president of Navajo Nation, when COVID a year ago was becoming evident, one of the things that he did was he really took charge, followed public health protocols, CDC protocols, to ensure the health, the security, and the well-being of the citizens of Navajo Nation, in terms of encouraging people to wear masks, encouraging to shelter in place, to encourage them not to gather together, and also then providing water and food and support to those tribal members in oftentimes isolated areas. I would also say that's also true for for the Pueblo communities in New Mexico. I know in talking with my family members and other tribal members that in fact, they established roadblocks. They wouldn't let people just come in and out of the community. They were restricting the movement of members in the community. They were doing home deliveries of food and water and other medical requirements that people might need, and really protecting. And this also goes for Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma and a number of other tribes. I'll just have to say have really responded in a remarkable fashion. I would say, and also in terms of being open to receiving the vaccinations. There was a study that was done recently that I think it was 40% of the people were open, or more than that actually, were open to receiving the vaccine. And I think this really reflects on something that is unique to Native people and Native culture, and that is that, for one thing, we have a history of dealing with since 1492, actually, have been dealing with all kinds of infectious disease that have been introduced to the Americas from foreign lands, and smallpox, you name it. There's a host of them, and that is part of our history and our memory. There also is, I think, a strong cultural value of protecting the tribe, protecting the people, with a special emphasis on protecting our elders and our seniors, because they, in fact, are the repositories of tradition, language, and cultural values. And so there's been a real positive response to ensure their lives and their health and their longevity that I think is unique. And it is not. I think that there is, because of our unique sets of conditions, there really is still a sense of tribal unity, of recognizing that we do require each other's support and help, and that in order to surmount many of the obstacles and challenges that Native people have faced in the past 500 years, that in fact we do recognize that we do need to come together, we do need to support each other's, we do need to love and care for each other's, which means we take care of each other's. I just want to, yeah, let's go ahead and let me just move on to the last quote. Well, I'm going to give you two for one, but this is the first one. And I particularly like this because, as you see, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, Stephen Hawking's. And I would say this is very befitting of Native people, because I would say Indian people, Indians in the Americas have to be some of the most intelligent people in the world, because we have survived every sort of catastrophe, Holocaust, genocide, and removal that ever took place on this planet. And we have adapted, we have survived, and we have no intention of going anywhere. The other thing I would share with you, and I should have opened with this, but was Will Rogers, Cherokee Indian humorist and social commentator, was fond of saying, we're all ignorant just about different things. And I've shared some of my knowledge and some of my ignorance, possibly. But I think the fact of the matter is, no one knows everything. The universe is vast, and there is too much for any human being to possibly comprehend. And I think that we are better off when we recognize not only what we know, but that we also recognize and are open to those things that we don't know. That makes us better. That makes us better human beings, when we are willing to admit that there is much we do not know. Then there's the opportunity to grow and learn. I would just say one last thing, and that is, I'm going to share, I want to reference that there is the public, I would encourage you to get a copy of the Lancet Commission report, Public Policy in the Trump Era. It is, there were 33 commissioners that were involved in the development of that document. It is a thorough historic analysis of where we are today and what brought us to this point in terms of social policy, in terms of public policy, and I think would be a valuable piece to you and all of us to better understand what we are confronted by today. I'll close now with a Mohawk prayer, and it goes: we send thanks to all the animal life in the world. They have many things to teach us as people. We are glad they are still here, and hope it will always be so. I will now be open to any sort of questions and comments and thoughts. Please unmute your mics, and let's have some fun now.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'll start. Can you talk a little bit about, in this day and age, what counselors who want to work with people in the Native American community, Indigenous peoples, but don't have that background themselves, what are some of the things that they can do to help better understand, to help learn, and to help break down some of the barriers that there might be to access?
Well, I would say I think that they need to have a conversation. They need to initiate conversations with those of us who have this lived experience. And I think that if one is sincere and one wants to learn in a respectful and have a respectful dialogue engagement, that is possible. I think that in spite of the fact that there was the Kellogg founded you'll find this interesting and amusing. The Kellogg Foundation funded a study that was looking at an issue that impacts Indian people, and that's being invisible. And out of that came the fact that 40% of the people in this country don't believe that there are still Native people. So that's fascinating. So, but the reality is that if one is really interested, there are you go online, you look at any urban area, many universities, many colleges have programs or staff that they could reach out to. The Indian Health Service has facilities. There's reservations and still in many areas. California, for example, has more reservations than any other state in the country. So I think it's just reaching out and initiating, exploring a conversation in a respectful way, and recognizing that they may not roll out the red carpet for you because in some cases people have been exploitive or and I guess if you're going to ask for something, then you should give something. That would be, sort of reciprocity is pretty important in whatever ways that one can offer that. But I've been involved with public health, and I've been out there in the public, both with the American Public Health Association nationally, continue to be involved. And we have an American Indian Alaska Native Hawaiian caucus that and a website. We have some incredibly talented, young, credentialed individuals. And if you really want to learn, it's there. Again, I don't expect somebody to just roll out the red carpet and particularly and check yourself and make sure you're going there with the right reasons, and the right sort of and wanting to have real engagement and conversation. And there are those of us who will have a conversation with anybody, anytime, any place. And and you may not hear what you want to hear, but you have to start somewhere.
Great. Does anybody else want to unmute and ask a question? I have more, but I don't want to hog the time, so I want to make sure other people get an opportunity.
I was that bad, I guess, huh?
Well, let me ask one more, and maybe it will help elicit some from the group as well, or maybe they're just still waking up this morning. But, one of the things that has become so apparent to me is the need to understand cultural traditions. We talk a lot in counseling about tobacco addiction, gambling addiction, and yet there's a very strong ceremonial, spiritual aspect to those things in many Native cultures, as well as it's one thing to have evidence-based treatments, but it's a very different thing to recognize the importance of things like drumming or sweat lodges or traditional healing practices. Can you give some insights in how I, as a non-Native American, might better respect and understand that in dealing with a client? Well,
I'll tell you what my perspective on that is, and it cuts across everything. Is that whenever I've gone to a new tribe or a new community, I've always made a point of doing some research in terms of the history of the tribe, the history of the community, the history of the people, and starting there as a starting point, because I don't believe you can really work with any community, any population, unless you have some grounding and understanding of the history of a people. And part of that history oftentimes in obviously will reflect cultural traditions, cultural practices. And there is, I'm happy to say, in recent years, there is much more being written about the value of traditional cultural practices. And Maureen, we'll have a longer conversation about this, but one of the things that came out of that experience I had in Phoenix, with all the disparities, was the fact that I did some research about the history of Indian running in the Americas. I wrote a paper that got published. I then developed a dissolved slide media presentation that documented the whole history of running and the role it played in the traditions and the history and the culture, and how the value that had for Native people. And to this day, that was extremely well received. And there is a legacy of positive health practice, traditional health practices that are just, this is only one aspect. This is the whole nature of running and ceremonial running, traditional running, and running for health. And there are other practices, drumming and other traditional, the dancing and that encourage positive behaviors and promote positive outcomes, versus when I grew up, it was really common. It was common among the community, young people, and I think the community in general, that if you didn't drink, you weren't Indian. I mean, that was something that was articulated, and of course, there's nothing that's so far from the truth, but the truth had been distorted, and unfortunately, some people had been in fact brainwashed to believe that you could not be Indian if you didn't drink.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the information. My name is Tony Sosa, and yeah, I agree with you about the history of our people. We had to learn about the history. I am from Mexico. There are many ties in our culture. So, but in learning about the history of our people, for example, is people who come from Mexico in the 1960s or 40s. And the people who comes now, the culture is way a little bit different, shift a little bit.
Right.
I don't know if you see that in your community, but in my community, I see this as a shifting in the new generation, the new people.
Yeah, no, I think, there are differences with every generation, and I think some of the immigration is people are coming from areas in South America that maybe they weren't 20 years ago. So it's a different populations for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes, at least in South America, from what I read, what my understanding of it is the political unrest, and the seeds to some of that political unrest had to do with the United States undermining sovereign governments and creating the conditions that are now manifesting themselves with the less than democratic sort of governments being in place.
Other questions from anybody in the group?
Yeah, my name is Taeson Lee. I'm working at the Asian Counseling Treatment Services, especially targeting at the Asian ethnic populations for problem gambling and substance use disorder. And I was so interested in your points, Mike, when at the beginning of your presentations, and your feeling about the young, presenter for your negative aspect of indigenous populations based upon these presentations and researches. As a first generation of an immigrant in Korean society, sometimes I have heard about these kind of cold and negative aspects of Korean cultural issues by so-called 1.5 generations of immigrants. They see lots of ugly and negative issues about the Korean culture in their childhood experience in American lifestyle from their parents. And so I felt like you heard, you experienced, I believe a culture is not a matter of wrong or right. Culture is just different. However, myself also try to see dysfunctional issues in Korean culture to treat my Korean addiction problems. Because I try to be pioneer for this area to try to correct and treat the Korean addiction problems. But I must be include myself also as a product of a Korean negative cultural environment. If I belong to myself in my clinical process, it would be powerful, I believe. So it's gotta be balanced.
Yes, I agree. Tae-san. I also have Korean cousins, so hey, we're related.
It was nice to hear you today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tae-san. I don't know if you heard me, but I have Korean cousins.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How could you have that kind of relationship?
Hey, Pueblos get around. Pueblos get around. I had a cousin who was in the military in Korea, and he found a lovely Korean woman, wife, brought her back to New Mexico. Many cousins now.
Good for you.
Yeah, so maybe we're related.
Michael, can you touch, we just have a few more minutes, but can you touch a little bit on how problems like gambling addiction or substance use addiction not only affect the individual, but because of the close-knit communities on reservations, that they end up impacting whole communities, families and communities?
Okay, yeah. Well, the what I would have to reflect back upon was some of what I mentioned earlier, in that, my own family, my dad had a history of substance abuse and was in and out of our family life. His brother, both of his brothers were challenged by substance abuse. One of them died violently unfortunately in a ditch. I can say that one of the challenges that I've had what was just dealing with that legacy, and when I was when I'll just say this, when I was a young man, I was a very angry young man, and I was angry at my father. I was angry at I had a lot of anger, and I guess on some level I recognized that, and it actually scared me. But anger, and this is not unusual. This happened. This anger, it was like a fire. It was like a fire that was burning in me, and I was afraid that it would get out of control and consume me. And because of that, I as a young man with my friends, I was a designated driver before there was a designated driver, and totally avoided alcohol because I was convinced, and for a long time was convinced that I would become my father. And but dealing with an issue like that consumes so much of your energy and your thought, and it does impact you. You know, I mean, it's something you don't just put in a box and put it away. You have to deal with it, and over the course of time, I have no problem admitting this. I've done therapy, been in therapy over the years, on and off, but have gotten to a point at which I'm really, I think after, you know, I've learned who I am and what I am and what I'm not. And I'm not my father. And I think my biggest fear was that I would be my father. And that tainted everything, that tainted my whole life. I mean, that tainted relationships, that tainted partners, that tainted everything, because I really didn't understand. I didn't understand it. I didn't control it. But going back to the fire is something that is important to know, because if you can control it, it can be extremely motivating. It can move you it can move you in directions. It can encourage. It helps you take on challenges and go places you wouldn't have gone on your own. And I would say that fire, it's still here. I think you can see it. You can hear it. That fire was what enabled me to pursue the credentials I have. That's the fire that that fueled me to become the first American Indian president of the American Public Health Association. That fire is what enabled me to be successful in my life. And so it's really and there are, I think, because of the oppression that exists for young men, particularly young men of color, it is something that one needs to understand in counseling, that there are people who've been hurt, abused, and are angry. And if one can help them understand that, if that's where they're at, there's the opportunity to really, it can take you places you never thought you would go. And I'm an example of that.
We've got time for one more question. Anybody in the group want to ask Michael to share his wisdom on something?
Or offer a thought even.
Or offer a thought, absolutely. Anyone in the group who's working in a behavioral health program on a tribal reservation who wants to share any thoughts about how that's working, how things have changed, how they need to continue to change?
Michael, I know there are lots of many different types of tribal and indigenous populations. Do you think there is some common sense among them, variety of different groups? Most of them, they share common value or beliefs, and so you can tell about them easily.
Well, if I understand your question, first of all, everybody who is native, they have a tribal identity. So they're more often than not, they know where they come from, they know where their parents came from, so they have that tribal identity. And then there are differences, but there are shared cultural, traditional, there are shared values that cut across all the different tribes in terms of valuing elders, in terms of in terms of recognizing, I think, clearly recognizing the relationship that we have to the land, and that we have to protect the land and protect the people. So there are certain values and traditions that cut across. We have our own, each tribe has their own way of doing things, but in many ways, there are some values that cut across, that transcend and cut across all those groups that bring us together, that we all can relate to.
But different language, they don't understand one another.
That's true. Yeah, in many cases, there are different languages. Go ahead.
Just like an Asian country, right?
Yes.
So when people see Asian people, and the people think, oh, they share their languages and cultures because of their skin of color is the same, but
Yes.
that's not true. Like,
Yeah.
Asian, totally different, among different nations.
Right. It's just like tribes too. I mean, we're all Indians, but we're different kind of Indians. There's the Lakota, there's Navajo, there's Pueblos, there's Chick. I mean, there are all kinds. Just as you said, just as with Asian community, Asian people, there's all kind, and they don't all speak the same language. There might be some things that are similar, but there's some real differences, and it's important to know the differences.
Well,
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, Taeson, that was great, because that is going to be a theme throughout the day, that there is this myth of the model minority. No two Native Americans are exactly alike. No two Asian cultures are exactly alike. When you start talking about Latino and Hispanic cultures, you're talking about language and geography. So really wonderful theme that we're going to see with Dr. Tam Din later today, and with our Latino Hispanic panel as well. So it is time for a 15-minute break. We hope you'll join us for the Canoe Journey and Grace Project video, but we'll see you again in just a little bit for our next presenter. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your wisdom with us. Really appreciate learning from your experience and your knowledge. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity. Be well. Take care. Wear your masks. Be safe.